They won their freedom with fire. They won it with strategy and blood and impossible courage. And then, 2 decades after the revolution that toppled slavery on an island called Saint-Domingue, the world's powers made a new demand: pay for your liberty, or we will take it back. What followed was not a negotiation. It was an ordered transfer of wealth, a sovereign ransom disguised as diplomacy, and it shaped Haiti for centuries to come. But who remembers that the price of recognition could be counted in gold? In April of 1825, under the restored Bourbon King Charles of Stedixins, France issued an ordinance that read like a ledger entry from a conqueror. Paris would recognize Haiti only if the Caribbean Republic accepted an indemnity to compensate the former plantation owners for their lost property. The sum set on the table was astronomical: 150 million gold francs, a demand backed implicitly by a fleet and the threat of renewed violence. It was later reduced on paper to 90 million, but the damage had already been done. A price meant to buy off former slaveholders became, in practice, a demand that the newly freed nation mortgage its future to the old empire. Imagine the scene in Port-au-Prince: candlelight on hastily kept ledgers, the nervous clink of coin, government emissaries racing to secure loans from European bankers who smelled profit in Haiti's plight. Haiti did not have the reserves to pay, so it borrowed. The first installment was financed by loans from French banks, loans that carried interest and conditions that stitched Haiti into a web of foreign creditors. The official story of a negotiated reduction obscures the deeper truth. The indemnity did not vanish when the number dropped on paper. New loans, renewed interest, and additional financial obligations turned a one-time ransom into a century of debt service. In practice, historians trace payments and related borrowing through the 19th and early 20th centuries, and some accounts argue that debts tied to these arrangements were still being cleared against Haiti and its coffers well into the 1940s. If stories like this make you see finance differently, as a weapon, a mirror, and a force that still shapes nations, take a second to subscribe. It helps us keep bringing hidden chapters of financial history to light. What did that mean for ordinary Haitians? Money that might have rebuilt soil, supported local markets, or financed public works, instead flowed into foreign pockets. The state had to extract revenue where it could: customs duties, export levies, taxes on peasant farmers. Exports like coffee and sugar were pushed to meet creditor demands rather than local needs. Forests were cleared faster to expand plantation land. Local artisanal economies shrank under the weight of an external claim that had nothing to do with Haitian well-being. The public ledger became a private drain. Over generations, the country's ability to invest in schools, roads, and health care was starved by repayments that began as compensation for human beings treated as property. There is an ugly logic in this history. A victorious, formerly enslaved people had to buy the right to be recognized on equal terms. Recognition had value: trade access, diplomatic ties, the soft power that keeps a nation from being treated as a pariah. But that value was subtracted from Haiti's future. When a state pays to be accepted, the balance of power shifts before its people can even vote. Those first loans created sovereign obligations that limited Haiti's fiscal options, forcing repeated borrowing and a reliance on external financiers who could dictate terms. Debt became a mechanism of control that looked like normal finance, but functioned like a leash. Numbers matter, but so do comparisons. Some modern reckonings attempt to translate the indemnity into present-day equivalents to show how colossal the transfer was. Conservative historical tallies suggest tens of millions of 19th-century francs actually changed hands. More expansive economic calculations that consider missed investment opportunities put the implied loss in the billions when measured across a century. Those calculations are not arguments for exact sums. They are a way to imagine the scale of what was taken, not just coins, but the productive capacity those coins would have bought and the compound advantages a sovereign nation would have enjoyed if it had been allowed to invest its own earnings. How different would Haiti have looked if its people had been allowed to keep and compound the fruits of their labor? The story reaches into our present. In the last decade, and especially during the bicentennial of the 1825 Ordinance, activists, scholars, and some political leaders framed this indemnity as an early vivid example of what we now call odious or illegitimate debt. Calls for redress grew louder. In 2025, France acknowledged the injustice in official language and announced a joint historical commission to study the legacy, a symbolic step that nonetheless reopened wounds and questions about whether acknowledgement is enough after 2 centuries of extraction. The present moment asks whether historical wrongs find remedy in commissions and apologies, or whether justice requires material repair. This is not merely a Haitian story. It is a case study in how financial policy can be an instrument of empire. Governments and bankers can paint coercion as commerce. They can call a ransom an indemnity. They can reduce a number on paper and pretend the moral ledger is settled, while the social ledger continues to bleed. The mechanism is elegant in its cruelty. Lend to the weak, require repayment on punitive terms, buy the assets when the weak cannot pay, and fold the country's economy into foreign capital circuits. The result is predictable. The debtor state is stuck in a loop where fiscal survival depends on more borrowing, and sovereignty becomes thin when every treasury decision must consider foreign creditors. And yet, the human dimensions persist. In the villages and ports of Haiti, stories passed down remember the cost of that settlement, not as an abstraction, but as a way of life, altered. Schools that might have been built did not appear. Roads that could have linked markets were not paved. Those absences multiplied across generations. Economic historians trace the long shadow of that choice through patterns of inequality, political fragility, and the country's vulnerability to natural disasters and foreign intervention. When disaster struck, the country had fewer buffers and less capacity to respond. That is not coincidence. It is the arithmetic of a century spent paying to be legitimate. If the past teaches anything about finance, it is this: money is never neutral. Financial instruments carry intent and power. Credit can emancipate or constrain. Loans can seed factories or harvest compliance. The Haitian ransom tells us how debt can restructure the sovereignty of a nation as surely as any treaty or treaty port. It asks a simple question that looks back and forward at once. If recognition can be bought, who owns the story of freedom? We end where the story began, with a choice that was not really a choice. Haiti fought for and won its independence. Then its freedom was priced, parceled, and paid for in installments that bled the economy dry. That sequence transformed an act of emancipation into a cautionary tale about how the global financial order can fold moral wrongs into the language of contracts. So what does justice look like? 2 centuries later, is it an apology, a commission, a reparative payment, or a redesigned architecture of global credit that allows formerly colonized nations to reclaim their fiscal agency? If this reframes what you thought you knew about independence and money, stay with us. The history of finance is a history of choices that look like mathematics until you look closer and see the people behind the numbers. Subscribe to the Finance Empire, and together we'll uncover how money built the world and how its echoes still shape the one we live in today.